I'm going to read from chapter 8, a moment where I'm recalling listening to my mother's stories. My mother is now 93. She was born in rural Cork in 1930. She left Ireland in 1948 to train as a nurse in England, a psychiatric nurse, and she worked as a psychiatric nurse for her working life. Once upon a time, my grandfather got lost on the bog. He was still a young man, not much more than a boy, and he was out in the Kerry Mountains, near Barnard Guiha, says my mother. I don't believe her. That's way too far away. Maybe he was on the slopes of Mount Gabriel, or more likely even closer to home in the hilly land on the way to Bantry. Anyway, he was lost, and as the night grew darker and darker, he began to worry and then to sweat. He didn't know where to put his foot for fear there'd be no ground and the bog opening up beneath him. So, he said to his daughter years later, and she now says to me, I turned my coat inside out twice, and all of a sudden he knew where he was and was able to find the way down. Of course, it makes sense, she says when she finishes the story. You'd have to concentrate pretty hard, turning the thick tweed, the pockets, the collar, pulling the arms through. That's why you'd have to do it twice. It would calm you down, all that concentrating, so you'd be able to think. My mother's stories are always like this. You think you're being led into a fairy tale. You meet old men dispensing wisdom, weird sisters, travelling people with rhymes and extraordinary skills with a needle. There are fireside revelations, strange noises, long journeys and death by water. And then she turns a little matter-of-fact pirouette at the end and offers a perfectly rational gloss on her own tale. An air of otherworldly mystery. You expect fairies to come out from their earthen mound under the hill, hitched to a thoroughly this-worldly account of her parents, brothers, sisters, neighbours, friends. She likes to have it both ways. I could describe her as a mixture of inheritances, like a character out of a 19th century novel, the folk beliefs and traditions of her rural ancestors, and the years of training in psychological reason, logic and psychiatry. But I'm much more interested in why she tells stories like this. She has turned her past into a fairy tale, an experience pushed so far back in time and space that it seems to have happened in another world. It's a way of making it safe. She wants to protect the past from the prying eyes of the present and the future, and she wants to neutralize its violence. She is frightened that cruelties enacted long ago still have the power to hurt, and keeping silent about her family history, minimizing the violence or transforming it into a fable, is the only way she knows to keep the future safe from harm. I understand the impulse, but I think it's the wrong way. So this book is about how we learn about the past when we have no records, and what we should do with the knowledge when we get it. Nearly 30 years ago, I was told a secret. I was told that in the mid-1950s, I had a first cousin, the daughter of my uncle, who was born in Bessborough Mother and Baby Home and was brought up in an orphanage in Clonakilty. At the time when I was told this, I was in my mid-20s, and I'd recently given birth to my own first baby, who I also had on my own, and I was shocked by the secret I had been told. I tried to speak to my mother about it. I wanted her to express the same kind of indignation at the injustice of what had happened to my cousin and her mother as I felt, but she wouldn't. She expressed great sorrow for what had happened and regret, but she refused to condemn the family's decision. This book is a record of how very slowly I have come to understand her way of thinking. Everyone here will, I am sure, remember the report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, which, while it condemned various aspects of the church and state's treatment of women and their children, stated that the primary responsibility for what happened lay with the parents of the girls who got pregnant and the fathers of their children. It seemed to me at the time not only an outrageous statement, but also an unhelpful one. It didn't explain anything. It didn't explain why families would turn to the institutions to solve their intimate problems. I wanted to ask why. Why did it make sense for families to choose this route? I think of the unhappiness people must have felt losing grandchildren, but also often losing daughters and sons because they believed in the system. And I think of the huge numbers of families who were involved. This question, why did it make sense to people, sent me back to my own family story. The trouble with trying to understand sexual, private, intimate behaviour is that mostly people don't talk about it, although maybe that isn't true anymore. There's a whole generation of young people who seem to talk about nothing else. But before the great tell-all age, mostly people didn't talk about it, and they certainly didn't write about it. There are no records, or very few, no written evidence to consult to explain how someone might have felt on learning that their daughter was pregnant outside marriage, for example, or that their son had fathered a child. Nonetheless, we are surrounded by half-told stories, rumours, silences, secrets, and that's our evidence. That's what we have to try to interpret if we're to understand this past. So this book is an investigation of some family secrets, and it's also an account of a culture of secrecy around sex and sexuality, which developed, I think, for very good reasons in the period after the famine, but which became very dangerous when new Catholic institutions developed after independence. My grandmother was born in 1891. In the period before independence, when she was growing up, no one was going to shop anyone to the authorities if they could help it, because the authorities were British. No one wanted to be an informer. People lived life, if they could, under the radar. The authorities were poor law guardians, the workhouses, the RIC. I argue in the book that keeping secrets in this period, particularly women keeping secrets between themselves, was a form of care. Women in rural Ireland had so little control over the direction of their lives, so little autonomy. But if you fell pregnant in this period, there were all sorts of informal ways in which a solution might be found. A child of an unmarried mother might be brought up as a child of an aunt or a grandmother, for example. This was a culture in which women looked after each other by keeping quiet, in which they passed all kinds of private information amongst themselves and didn't pass dangerous information to others if they could help it. So that's one phase of what I try and think about in the book. But I think that one of the consequences of this highly developed practice of silence was that families had no defences when the Catholic mother and baby homes developed and the priests and nuns said, "We'll keep your secrets for you." The homes weren't secret, of course. They weren't, huge things right in the middle of towns. And they were part of an even larger network of institutions, but they were in the business of secrecy. They seemed to offer an official, bureaucratic answer to families who used them because they thought it was the right thing to do. So as I say, part of the process of me writing this book has been to try and understand why it made sense for families to use the institutions, not because they were heartless, but because they thought they were doing the right thing. And yet, we clearly need to balance understanding and compassion for the people who didn't know what else to do, people like my grandmother, with an acknowledgement of the harm that came to many mothers and their children. My grandmother, my cousins' grandparents on the other side, all the grown-ups involved made a mistake in 1954, a mistake that had tragic consequences. And part of what I've tried to do in the book is to do justice both to the harm done and to some of the reasons why it was done. In trying to acknowledge the different sides of these stories, I've come to the conclusion that the term responsibility isn't particularly helpful. I think there are important questions about church and state responsibility for the harms that came to women and children in the homes. And I mean by that both a legal and a moral responsibility. I think that redress and reparation should happen and should happen fairly. But beyond that, I am not sure responsibility is a helpful concept. It brings with it connotations of guilt and blame which get in the way of understanding, particularly understanding the family dimension. Because actually, staying silent about how our families were involved is like an admission of guilt and responsibility, as though it is still a source of shame. But those secrets have outlived their usefulness. We should be able to look back on this history with compassion and understanding rather than blame. And we will never be able to understand why families acted as they did unless we talk about it. I prefer the concept of answerability. As members of the families who were caught up in this history, relatives of people who may have made bad decisions and made mistakes, we are not responsible for what happened, but we are, as a community, answerable. There's just one more thing I'd like to say before we move on to the conversation part of today. Secrets and silence are the subject of my book, but they are also the method. I wrote the book by trying to work out what was meant when things weren't said, or when a story didn't quite add up. I say in the book that we all know what it feels like to inherit a story and a set of beliefs we only partially understand. But I'm convinced that the manner in which we inherit the past, how we know about it and how we think about it, not simply what we know about it, can tell us important things about how we live in the present. That probably sounds rather abstract, but in practice, what it meant for me writing this book is that I had to examine my own shame, think about the silences I haven't wanted broken. I tell a story about a baby of mine who died, and I went through a series of really bonkers behaviours around that. But I didn't really feel I could write about other people's losses unless I really went into the feelings that I had experienced at that time. I talk about my shame, about my own half-Irishness, kind of quasi-illegitimacy as an Irish person. Obviously, I'm using the word there as a metaphor at this point. If we haven't got written records explaining how and why families made use of the institutions and what they thought about them, we do have ourselves. We are the records. We are the archives of this history. And one thing we might be able to do to get closer to an understanding of the past is to read the traces it has left in us. Thank you.